He was once a man everyone in town respected. People would wave when they saw him in his police uniform, children would smile because they felt safe around him, and shopkeepers often greeted him with warm words. He had worked hard for that badge, training through long nights and endless drills, telling himself he would one day be a protector. But deep inside, behind the calm face he showed the world, he was also a man with a heart that could not handle rejection. And this weakness slowly grew, changing him in ways he never imagined. Years earlier, he had fallen deeply in love with a woman who was different from everyone else he had met. She was gentle yet strong, quiet yet confident. She didn't care much about money, status, or the shine of his uniform. What she cared about was honesty and kindness. At first, their relationship was beautiful. They spent evenings walking in the park, laughing about little things, and sharing meals in small cafes where no one bothered them. He believed she was the missing piece of his life, and he built his future dreams around her presence. He even thought that marrying her one day would make his life complete. But as time passed, cracks began to show. He wanted her to always listen to him, to do things his way, to stay in his shadow. He thought he was protecting her, but she felt it was control. She wanted freedom, independence, and space to make her own choices. Arguments started quietly and then grew louder. She tried to explain that love could not live where there was no trust or freedom. He tried to insist that his love was enough to make her stay. The more he pushed, the more she pulled away. Finally, after one long night filled with arguments, she decided to walk away for good. She told him it was not because she hated him, but because she wanted to live her life without fear of being controlled. She wished him well, but she chose to close the door on the relationship. For her, it was a step toward peace. For him, it was the beginning of an emptiness that swallowed him whole. After the breakup, his world slowly began to change. He still wore his uniform, still went on patrol, still looked calm on the outside. But on the inside, he was restless. He could not accept that she was gone. He replayed every conversation in his head, searching for a way he could have convinced her to stay. He convinced himself that she would come back if only she saw how much he loved her. Yet love, when mixed with obsession, often turns into something else entirely. He started visiting the places where she used to go, pretending it was coincidence. He passed by the cafe she liked, hoping to see her face. Sometimes he parked his car on the street where she lived, sitting silently with the lights off, watching to see when she came home. To his friends, he said he was fine. To his colleagues, he acted as if everything was normal. But deep down, he was becoming a prisoner of his own thoughts. The woman, on the other hand, was trying to rebuild her life. She focused on her job, spent time with her friends, and tried to find joy in small everyday moments. She felt relief after leaving the relationship, though she also carried sadness for what could have been. She did not hate him, she simply could not go on with someone who saw love as control. At times, she worried about him, because she knew how deeply he once cared for her. But she also believed that with time, he would move on. Yet, he did not move on. Instead, he became more consumed by the idea of winning her back. He told himself that she didn't really mean what she said, that she was only confused, that she just needed to be reminded of their past. The more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that it was his duty to save the relationship. He began to confuse love with possession, protection with authority. People in town started to notice small changes in him. He was quieter during his shifts. He sometimes lost focus when responding to calls. His eyes often looked tired, as if he had been awake all night. A few fellow officers joked that he was still heartbroken, not realizing how deep the problem really was. To them, it was nothing unusual. After all, many people go through breakups. But this was different. This was a man who could not let go. At night, he would sit in his room, staring at old photographs of them together. In those photos, she was smiling brightly, and he would whisper to himself that she still loved him, that she just didn't understand it yet. He would replay old text messages, reading them again and again, holding on to words of love that were spoken years before. His heart was drowning in the past, unable to accept the reality of the present. The woman, unaware of how far his thoughts had gone, continued her life with quiet determination. She started learning new skills, joined a community group, and even thought about moving to a different part of the city to get a fresh start. She believed she had finally escaped the shadows of her old relationship. But in truth, the shadows were still following her. One evening, as she was leaving her workplace, she noticed a car parked across the street. Its engine was off, but she could see a familiar outline in the driver's seat. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew who it was. For a moment, she told herself it was just coincidence. But as the days went by, she noticed the same car near her apartment, near the grocery store, even near the park. Her unease grew, but she did not want to create trouble. She hoped that if she ignored it, he would eventually give up. For him, however, every sight of her only deepened his desire to get her back. Every time he saw her walking confidently, smiling with friends, or simply living her life, he felt both longing and anger. He told himself that she was supposed to be with him, that no one else could care for her the way he could. His heart was not asking anymore, it was demanding. This was the turning point, though neither of them realized it yet. The woman thought she was moving on, and he thought he was fighting for love. But what was growing inside him was not love, it was desperation. A desperation so strong that it would soon push him to cross a line from which there was no return. And so, the stage was set. A man once admired, struggling to accept reality, letting his emotions take control of his judgment. A woman, brave enough to walk away from control, trying to live her life in peace. Two people once connected by love, now standing on opposite sides of a story that was only just beginning. After the breakup, his life slowly turned into a cycle of waiting and watching. Each morning he still wore his uniform, polished his shoes, and walked out of his home as if nothing was wrong. To the world, he was still the officer who kept order in town. But inside his mind, he carried a storm. Every call he answered, every routine patrol, every smile he gave to the public was only a mask. Beneath it all, he was thinking of her. At first, his thoughts were soft, almost hopeful. He told himself she would call him any day now. He believed that once she had space to think, she would remember their good times. He imagined her missing him, reaching for her phone, and deciding to return. But as weeks passed and no message came, his hope turned to doubt, and doubt slowly turned to frustration. He could not understand why she stayed away when he loved her so deeply. Soon, his days were no longer about protecting the community, they were about following her steps. He began memorizing her schedule when she left for work, which bus she took, what time she returned home. Sometimes he parked near her street before dawn, just to watch the lights in her apartment window turn on. The moment she stepped out, dressed neatly for her job, he would feel a mix of pride and pain. Pride, because she was still the same strong and graceful woman he admired. Pain, because she was living that life without him. The woman, meanwhile, was trying her best to keep her world bright. She poured her energy into work, often staying late to complete projects. Her co-workers liked her because she was hardworking yet kind, always ready to help others. They noticed that sometimes her smile looked a little forced, as if she carried a hidden weight. But they respected her privacy and never asked too many questions. She wanted her life to move forward, free from old shadows, and she did not want to bring her personal struggles into the office. Still, deep inside, she sometimes felt uneasy. Every so often she sensed eyes on her, as though someone was following. When she walked home at night and heard footsteps behind her, her heart would beat faster. When she looked back and saw a car she recognized, her stomach would tighten. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, but the feeling was too strong to ignore. He noticed this, too. He could see that she grew more alert, glancing over her shoulder, quickening her steps. But instead of realizing that his presence frightened her, he told himself it was proof that she still cared. He thought that if she truly wanted him gone, she would confront him. Since she didn't, he believed she was waiting for him to make the first move. This was the dangerous lie he kept repeating until it sounded like truth. As time went on, his behavior became more obsessive. He began writing her letters but never sent them. In those letters, he poured out his feelings, promising to change, begging her to return, insisting that their love was stronger than any argument. He left them stacked neatly in a drawer at home, as if one day he would deliver them all at once and she would finally understand. Sometimes, he even practiced conversations with her in the mirror. He would stand tall, imagining she was there, and say, "You belong with me. No one else can protect you like I can." He rehearsed her replies in his head, always hearing the answer he wanted, "Yes, I will come back." These imaginary talks gave him temporary comfort, but they also pushed him deeper into his obsession. Colleagues started noticing he was different. During patrols, he often drifted into silence, lost in thought. When asked about simple reports, he sometimes forgot details. A few officers joked that he was still heartbroken, but one senior colleague grew concerned. He pulled him aside one day and said gently, "You need to let it go. Focus on your duty. Don't lose yourself in the past." He nodded politely, but the words went in one ear and out the other. His heart was not ready to let go. The woman's friends also grew worried. One evening, she confessed to a close friend that she sometimes saw her ex nearby. "Maybe it's just coincidence," she said, trying to laugh it off. But her friend shook her head. "That's not coincidence. You need to be careful. If he hasn't moved on, he could do something foolish." The woman wanted to believe that he was still the same decent man she once loved, just confused and hurt. She did not want to think he could cross a dangerous line. But the truth was, he was already standing on that line. He began convincing himself that he had the right to win her back, no matter how. His pride, his uniform, his sense of authority all fed into his obsession. He told himself she was safer with him than with anyone else. The thought of her meeting someone new filled him with rage, though she had not even done so. He started to see her independence as a betrayal, rather than her right. One night, he parked outside her apartment for hours. Rain tapped softly on his windshield as he watched the window of her living room glow. He imagined she was reading a book, maybe sipping tea, maybe laughing at something on the television. The warmth of that image pierced him. He whispered to himself, "That should be me beside her." The longer he sat, the more his feelings boiled. By the time he drove away, his mind was no longer calm. He began to think of ways to force the future he wanted. The woman, meanwhile, tried to ignore her fears. She told herself she had walked away for a reason, and she must stay strong. She focused on her personal growth, signing up for an evening class to learn new skills. She dreamed of traveling one day, starting fresh in another city where she could fully breathe. She still believed her ex would eventually move on and find peace. But she underestimated how far his obsession had grown. The community around them remained unaware. To neighbors and townsfolk, he was still the officer who waved at children and nodded politely to shopkeepers. To them, she was the hard-working woman who lived quietly and minded her own business. No one saw the storm building behind closed doors. No one guessed that soon, their paths would collide in a way that would shock everyone. For now, their lives moved in parallel, hers toward healing, his toward desperation. The more she tried to live freely, the more he convinced himself she was slipping away forever. And that thought was unbearable to him. He was no longer asking himself whether he should let go. He was asking how he could hold on, even if it meant crossing lines that should never be crossed. The story of love had ended. But in his heart, he refused to accept the ending. And in that refusal, his desperation grew stronger, setting the stage for choices that would soon change both of their lives forever. The night that would change everything started quietly, almost like any other. The streets were calm, the air carried the cool touch of evening, and people were returning home after long days. For most, it was an ordinary night. But for him, it was the moment when his desperation finally crossed into action. He had been waiting, watching, and hoping for months. Now, he told himself he could not wait anymore. He had convinced himself that love could be brought back if only he showed her how serious he was. He thought if she saw the depth of his feelings, if she realized how much he was willing to do for her, she would finally understand. He believed his heart was guiding him, but in truth, his mind was clouded by obsession. That evening, he sat in his car outside her apartment again. The glow from her window was faint, the soft yellow light spilling onto the street. He imagined her reading or preparing dinner, unaware that he was only a few feet away. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. His thoughts circled like a storm. She belongs with me, she just forgot, I will remind her. His hand rested near his service weapon, the one he carried daily as a symbol of authority. To him, the weapon represented power, certainty, and control. But that night, in his troubled state, it began to mean something else. He began to see it as a way to demand what he thought he deserved. Inside the apartment, the woman was tidying up after dinner. She hummed softly to herself, trying to keep her spirit light. She had worked late that day, and her body was tired, but she was content in her own quiet way. She thought of her plans for the future, of moving to a new place where she could start over. She believed the worst was behind her. She did not know that the storm she had feared was about to arrive at her very door. It was past 9 when she decided to step out for a short walk. She liked to clear her mind before bed, to breathe the night air and feel the calm of the world slowing down. She wrapped a light scarf around her shoulders and locked her door behind her. As she walked down the street, she felt a chill not just from the air, but from an old, familiar sensation. She glanced around and noticed a figure stepping out from the shadows. Her steps slowed, her heart already guessing who it was. It was him. His tall figure was unmistakable, his uniform jacket still on though he was off duty. At first, she froze, unsure whether to greet him politely or walk away. Before she could decide, he stepped closer, his eyes fixed on hers. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and heavy. She tried to stay calm. "There's nothing more to say. I've made my choice. Please respect that." But he shook his head. "No. You don't mean that. I know you still love me. You're just confused." Her pulse quickened. She tried to step back, but he followed, his steps firm. She realized this was not just a chance meeting. He had planned this. She raised her voice a little, hoping someone might hear. "I don't want this conversation. Please leave me alone." That was the moment he reached for his weapon. In one sharp motion, he pulled it out and pointed it at her. The cold steel gleamed under the streetlight, and her breath caught in her chest. Her world seemed to stop. "Say it," he demanded. "Say you still love me." Her knees weakened, and she felt a wave of fear like never before. She had always believed he might follow her, maybe argue with her, maybe plead for another chance. But never had she imagined this. Still, even in her fear, a part of her mind stayed clear. If she resisted, he might lose control. If she screamed, he might panic. She had to stay calm to survive. Her lips trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "All right. I still love you. Please, put the gun down." For a moment, his face softened. Her words were the ones he had longed to hear. But then suspicion clouded his eyes. "You don't mean it," he muttered. "You're just saying that because I'm holding this." Her heart raced, but she tried to steady her voice. "I mean it. I'm saying it because it's true. Please, let's just talk without this." He kept the weapon steady, torn between believing her and doubting her. His breathing grew louder, his eyes restless. Around them, the street seemed painfully quiet. But not everyone was blind to what was happening. A neighbor across the street had stepped out to throw away some trash. From the corner of his eye, he saw the officer standing too close to the woman, saw the shine of the weapon under the light. Shock froze him for a second, but then instinct pushed him back inside to grab his phone. Within moments, he was calling the police. His voice shook as he explained what he saw. Back on the street, the woman's mind worked quickly. She knew help might be coming if anyone had noticed. She just had to stay alive long enough. She looked into his eyes, not at the gun, and spoke softly. "I remember the good times. I don't want to fight with you. Please, if you put that away, we can talk like before." His hand trembled slightly. His mind was caught in a battle between desire and doubt, between the love he believed in and the reality before him. For the first time, he seemed uncertain. The silence of the street was broken suddenly by the sound of distant sirens. The woman's heart leapt with hope. His eyes widened. He realized he was no longer hidden, no longer in control. He looked at her, then at the approaching lights, and his face twisted with panic. "Who called them?" he whispered, his voice shaking. She took a small step back, praying he would not fire. "Please, don't do this. It's over. You can still stop." The sirens grew louder. Tires screeched as patrol cars arrived, lights flashing red and blue against the dark street. Within seconds, several officers stepped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. "Drop your weapon. Put it down now." He froze, caught between his colleagues and his obsession. For a moment, the woman thought he might refuse. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with trembling hands, he slowly lowered the weapon and let it fall to the ground. The officers rushed in, pulling him back, restraining him as he struggled weakly. The woman collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with both fear and relief. Neighbors peeked through curtains and doorways, whispering in shock at the scene. The man who had once been a symbol of protection was now standing in handcuffs, his head bowed. The woman, though shaken, was alive. She had faced fear and survived by keeping her mind steady in the most terrifying moment of her life. That night would stay with both of them forever. For her, it was proof of her strength and her will to lie free. For him, it was the moment his choices caught up to him, the moment he realized that love could never be forced, and control could never replace care. But this was only the beginning of the consequences. The night had ended, but the story of justice was about to unfold. The flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet street in colors of chaos. What had begun as an ordinary evening had turned into a scene no one would forget. The once respected officer stood with his hands restrained, his weapon lying cold on the pavement. His colleagues, men who had once trusted him with their lives, were now holding him back as if he were a stranger. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, pressing on everyone's chest. For the woman, it was a blur of sound and light. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hardly hear the orders being shouted around her. All she knew was that she was alive. Her body trembled uncontrollably, her knees weak, and her breath shallow. She clutched her scarf tightly, as if holding onto something familiar would anchor her in that storm. A young officer rushed to her side, gently guiding her away from the scene. "You're safe now," he said softly, though she wasn't sure she fully believed it yet. The man, meanwhile, felt the cold metal of handcuffs pressing against his wrists. His mind spun with disbelief. He had been the one who wore the badge, the one who gave the orders, the one who kept the streets safe. Now, in a single night, the roles were reversed. His brothers in uniform looked at him with a mixture of sorrow and anger. Some shook their heads, unable to accept what they were seeing. Others avoided his eyes, as if they could not bear to face the truth. As he was led toward the patrol car, neighbors whispered from their windows. The man they had once trusted was now being taken away like a criminal. Shock rippled through the community. How could someone who had sworn to protect turn his weapon on someone he once claimed to love? That question lingered like smoke in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore. At the station, the weight of the situation became even clearer. The man sat in a small room, his head hanging low. Across from him, an internal affairs officer prepared to question him. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent light above. He did not speak much. What could he say? That it was love? That it was desperation? That he had lost control? None of those words could excuse what had happened. The woman was also brought to the station to give her statement. Though shaken, she spoke with quiet bravery. Her voice trembled at times, but she did not falter. She explained how he had followed her for months, how he had confronted her, and how he had finally raised his weapon against her. The officers listening wrote down every detail, their pens scratching on paper. Some of them stole glances at her, their expressions heavy with sympathy. They admired her courage, but their hearts ached for the fear she had endured. When the questioning was over, she sat in a waiting room with a blanket around her shoulders. The night had drained her, but she knew she had done the right thing. She had told the truth, even though it was painful. She had refused to stay silent, even though part of her still remembered the man he used to be. She no longer saw him as the protector she once admired, but as a warning of what happens when love becomes control. Back in his cell, the man's thoughts were filled with regret and confusion. He replayed the night over and over, trying to understand how it had come to this. He told himself he only wanted her back, that he never meant to harm her. But deep down, he knew the truth, pointing a weapon had crossed a line that could never be undone. He had allowed his emotions to destroy not only his relationship but also his career, his reputation, and the trust of the community he once served. The police department now faced a painful challenge. How could they hold one of their own accountable? To ignore it would mean betraying their duty. To punish him would mean admitting that one of their protectors had failed. Meetings were held behind closed doors, where senior officers debated the case. But in the end, the answer was clear: no one is above the law, not even a man who wore the uniform. News of the incident spread quickly. Local papers printed headlines that shocked readers. Officer arrested after threatening ex-lover. The story sparked anger and sadness in the community. People who had once greeted him with respect now questioned whether they ever really knew him. Parents told their children that love should never look like fear. Teachers used the story as a lesson in control and boundaries. Everyone seemed to take something from what had happened, even if it was only a quiet reminder that authority must be used with care. For the woman, the days that followed were filled with mixed emotions. She was relieved to be alive, but her heart carried scars. She replayed the moment when the weapon was pointed at her, the cold fear that had wrapped around her chest. At night, sleep came slowly, interrupted by memories she could not forget. Yet, despite her pain, she stood tall. She refused to let fear define her. With the support of friends and neighbors, she began to heal, one day at a time. She also became an example of courage for others. When asked to speak to local groups about her experience, she agreed. She wanted people to know that silence only protects the wrong person. She encouraged others to speak up when they felt unsafe, reminding them that strength is not found in staying quiet but in telling the truth. Her words inspired many, especially those who had once felt powerless. The man's trial was scheduled quickly. The evidence was clear, the witnesses firm. His fellow officers testified, describing the moment they had arrived and seen him holding the weapon. The neighbor who called the police spoke with trembling hands, explaining what he saw. And the woman, standing bravely before the court, gave her testimony with honesty and strength. She did not raise her voice in anger, she simply told the truth, and the truth was powerful enough. As the trial unfolded, the man sat silently, listening to the accounts of his actions. Each word felt like a stone added to the weight already on his chest. He saw the disappointment in the faces of people who had once admired him. He realized that his uniform could not protect him from the consequences of his choices. For the first time, he truly understood what he had lost, not just her, but everything he had built his life around. The jury's decision was firm. He was found guilty of misconduct and threats, charges that carried heavy consequences. The judge spoke with stern clarity, reminding the courtroom that authority must never be abused, that love can never be forced, and that fear is not a foundation for any relationship. The sentence was pronounced, and with it, the man's future was sealed. The courtroom was silent as he was led away. Some shook their heads, some whispered in disbelief, but no one argued. Justice had been served. For the woman, it was not a moment of joy but of closure. She did not celebrate his downfall. Instead, she carried a quiet relief that it was finally over, that she could now step forward without looking over her shoulder. She had faced fear and told her truth, and in doing so, she had given herself the gift of freedom. The story spread beyond the town, reaching people who had never met her or him. Many saw it as a reminder that even those who wear uniforms are human, and humans can make terrible mistakes. Others saw it as a lesson about love, that it must always be built on respect and trust, never on control or threats. And for some, it was a spark of courage, reminding them that they, too, could stand up and speak out. That night, when she returned home after the trial, she stood by her window and looked at the quiet street. The same place where fear once stood now felt different. The air was lighter, the silence kinder. She closed her eyes and whispered a small prayer of gratitude for her life, for her strength, and for the chance to begin again. The trial was over, and the judgment had been made. The man who once wore a badge with pride now wore the weight of his mistakes. The sound of the gavel striking echoed in the courtroom, and with it came the finality of his conviction. He was no longer an officer. He was no longer the man the community respected. He was simply a person who had let desperation and pride destroy everything he once stood for. When he was led away in handcuffs, his shoulders slumped, his eyes downcast, and his steps heavy. He had entered the courtroom with hope that maybe, somehow, the jury would show mercy, that maybe his past service would speak louder than his actions. But in the end, the truth had been undeniable. He had pointed a weapon at someone he once loved. He had betrayed the trust of his community. He had crossed a line that could never be erased. For the woman, the verdict brought a strange mixture of emotions. She sat quietly in the courtroom after everyone left, still processing what had happened. She had waited months for this day, yet when it arrived, it did not feel like victory. It felt like a heavy chapter closing. She did not hate him, despite what he had done. A part of her still remembered the man he had once been, the one who made her laugh during evening walks, who promised to protect her, who dreamed of a future together. But that man had been buried under obsession and control, and she could no longer hold on to who he used to be. As she stepped out of the courthouse, the world outside felt brighter somehow. The sky was clear, the sun gentle, and the streets busy with life. For the first time in a long time, she felt she could breathe freely. She knew the journey of healing was far from over, but she also knew she was no longer living under the shadow of fear. Back in his cell, The man sat silently, staring at the wall. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. He spent long hours replaying the choices that led him here. At first, he blamed others, his colleagues for not stopping him sooner, the neighbors for calling the police, the woman for leaving him. But slowly, the anger faded, replaced by a bitter realization: it was his own actions, and his alone, that had brought him here. He had mistaken control for love, and in doing so, he had lost everything. Letters came from his family, some filled with disappointment, others with sorrow. Few visited him. The world outside moved on quickly, but he remained frozen, trapped in his own mistakes. The uniform he once wore proudly was gone, his badge stripped from him, his name whispered with shame instead of respect. He had dreamed of being remembered as a protector, but now he was remembered as a warning. The woman, meanwhile, chose to turn her pain into strength. She began speaking at community events, sharing her story with honesty and courage. She did not do it for attention but to help others who might be suffering silently. She spoke to young women about the importance of boundaries, about the difference between love and control, and about the power of speaking up. Each time she told her story, she felt a little lighter, as if releasing the weight of the past piece by piece. Her courage inspired many. People came to her quietly after her talks, thanking her for giving them the strength to leave harmful relationships, or for showing them that silence was not the answer. Some even shared their own painful stories with her, and together they found healing in shared truth. Slowly, she realized that her experience, though painful, could be used to bring light into the lives of others. The community also learned lessons from what had happened. The police department introduced new training on emotional health, ensuring officers could get help before their struggles grew dangerous. Counselors were made available, and conversations about mental health became more open. People understood that carrying a badge did not make someone immune to human weakness, and that asking for help was not a sign of failure but of strength. For the woman, healing took time. Nights were still hard, memories still returned when she least expected them, and there were days when the fear tried to creep back in. But each time, she reminded herself of how far she had come. She surrounded herself with supportive friends, pursued her dreams, and slowly built a new life. She traveled as she once hoped, saw new places, and created new memories that did not carry shadows from the past. Years later, when she thought back to the man she once loved, her heart no longer trembled. Instead, she felt a quiet sadness for the path he had chosen. She wished he had sought help instead of control, that he had let go instead of holding on so tightly. She hoped, wherever he was, he had found some peace inside himself. But she no longer carried the burden of his choices. That weight was no longer hers to bear. The man, serving his sentence, also changed in small ways. Away from the uniform, away from the power, away from the constant responsibility of being an officer, he was forced to face himself. He began attending sessions in prison where people talked about control, anger, and obsession. At first, he resisted, unwilling to admit weakness. But over time, he listened. He saw himself in the stories others shared, and slowly, he began to understand the truth of what he had done. One day, he wrote a letter not to ask for forgiveness, not to beg for a second chance, but simply to acknowledge his mistakes. He wrote to the woman, saying he was sorry for the fear he had caused, sorry for the trust he had broken, sorry for the life he had tried to control. He did not expect her to reply, and she never did. But writing the letter was his way of finally admitting to himself that what he had done was wrong, that love cannot be forced, and that respect is the foundation of any relationship. Life moved on for both of them, but the lessons of their story remained. The community never forgot how quickly admiration can turn into disappointment when power is misused. Young people remembered her story as a reminder to value themselves and never mistake control for affection. Officers in training remembered his story as a warning that wearing a uniform means responsibility, not ownership. In the end, the story was not just about a man's downfall or a woman's survival. It was about the truth that love must always be free, that respect is the greatest form of care, and that control, no matter how it is dressed, can never replace genuine affection. It was also about courage, the courage of a woman who refused to stay silent, the courage of neighbors who acted quickly, and the courage of a community that chose justice over loyalty to one of their own. The night of fear had passed, and from it grew lessons that would outlive both of them. The man, once proud in his uniform, now lived with the consequences of his choices. The woman, once afraid for her life, now lived with the strength of her survival. And the community, once shocked and broken, now carried wisdom that could guide future generations. The story closed not with anger but with reflection. It was a reminder that the line between love and control is fragile, and crossing it can destroy lives. It was proof that truth, though painful, brings freedom. And it was a lesson that even in the darkest moments, courage and honesty can light the way forward.